November issue of Down East magazine is now out with a cover that's going to have a lot of people saying, "Oh, look at that nose." Rob talked about that story and more with Down East's new editor-in-chief, Will Grunwald, and they began their conversation by turning to an article on Maine's general stores.
What was the approach that you guys were taking on this one?
Yeah, sure. So, the idea for the piece really started with a conversation with one of our staff photographers, Dave Waddell, who lives in Owl's Head. The Owl's Head General Store had closed in, I want to say, 2017. Reopened in 2020. The woman who started it up again was a 26-year-old girl, never owned her own business before. Meant a ton to the community for it to be back. And that just got us thinking about, general stores as a little bit of a dying breed, and we wanted to go exploring and check some other ones out.
There aren't new ones coming along, and the old ones, so many of them are kind of the heartbeat of the community.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So, so many have closed. One in this issue, North Star Variety, up in the county, used to be among, that stretch around Eagle Lake, used to have so many general stores. Now there are but a couple or a few. They're one of the last holdouts. So many others have either evolved into upscale markets or nice restaurants, but to truly be a general store means so much because the towns they're in generally aren't for convenience. There isn't a lot else around. They really, people count on them.
Well, let's talk about the cover story, which is on the SEAL rescue operation, Marine Mammals of Maine. This is something that people are familiar with because they've seen the photos in news stories. They've seen the video in news stories. So again, what was the angle that you guys took in telling this story?
Yeah, absolutely. The organization itself is kind of amazing, and that's a good chunk of the story, is just looking at the work they do. We look specifically at their rescues of seals in this issue. They also rescue or work with whales, dolphins, porpoises, sea turtles, which aren't mammals, but they, shoehorn them in.
Right.
The story itself is also couched in this context, though, about historical animosity towards seals in Maine and New England more generally. Fishermen in the 1900s worried about seals eating their catch. They still do a little bit, and we've had this resurgence of seal population, so there's this tension between the impulse to save them and wondering about their effect on fisheries and the ecosystem as a whole.
They haven't always been viewed with the adoration that so many people have for them now. They weren't always on calendars and note cards and so forth, but it's an interesting story. Good article. Let's end with one more. It's on the state of beer in Maine. And you begin with the point that the craft beer industry in Maine has really only been around for the wink of an eye when you look at the history of beer in other places.
Oh, it's incredible. Yeah, it's all new still, really. There's a lot of history because so much has happened, but at the same time, the article is predicated on the 40th anniversary of David Geary opening D.L. Geary Brewing. That was in 1983. There were no other breweries in New England at the time.
Yeah, that was the first in New England.
Yeah, and Sam Adams was 1984, a year later. Granted, Geary's didn't pour their first beer till I think 86, so some room for debate there. But yeah, and we wanted to just take the opportunity to look at some of that history and also some of the current trends that are reshaping the beer landscape.
One of the trends that you look at is the absolute micro breweries, the places that are really tiny, and you profile some of them. That must have been fun to look at these places that are just absolute labor of love operations.
Yeah, and that's how the craft beer movement started, right? It was tiny little operations. Guys like Rob Todd out on Industrial Way, starting Allagash by himself, converting dairy equipment into brewing equipment. And there are still people doing that, which I think is really cool, despite how big the beer scene has gotten. Tattooed Dad in Jackson, Frosty Bottom in Belfast, which operates on a CSA type model, which is totally unusual in the beer world. Just scrappy operations, total labor of love. It's really fun to see, and those places are such vital hangouts in rural parts of the state.
It's a good look at the craft brewing industry in Maine, which is pretty extraordinary. Whatever we're up to now, 150, 160 breweries in a state with 1.3 million people. It's literally a brewery for every 9,000 people or something like that. Just crazy.
You, of course, will find all of those stories and more in the November issue of Down East.